In the past few hours, Donald Trump announced what many considered unlikely just a few days ago, a ceasefire between the United States and Iran. According to his own words, it is a total victory, an agreement that, he says, could mark the end of the conflict within a matter of weeks. The news spread quickly, markets reacted, governments responded, and for a moment, global tensions seemed to ease. But as more details begin to emerge, questions are starting to appear, because this agreement is not a final peace treaty. It is a pause, temporary, limited to 2 weeks, and that completely changes the interpretation, because in conflicts at this level, a pause does not necessarily mean an end. It can mean something else, an attempt to contain the situation, a window to reorganize, or even a decision made under pressure. And this is where the real question begins. Are we looking at a victory, or at an agreement that leaves more uncertainty than certainty? To understand it, we have to look beyond the announcement. We have to analyze what actually changed, and what did not. One of the most important aspects of the conflict remains the control of energy routes, especially the Strait of Hormuz. A significant portion of the world's oil passes through this area. Any disruption to that flow directly affects the global economy, and according to early reports, that control has not changed. Iran maintains its influence over that route, and that raises the first major question. If the goal was to limit that power, why wasn't it altered? But that's not the only key issue. There is also the nuclear question. For weeks, this was one of the main justifications for the conflict. However, so far, there is no clear confirmation that this agreement includes significant changes in that area. Trump has stated that the situation is under control, but from the other side, there is no direct statement confirming it, and that leaves a gap, a space where the information is not fully clear. Meanwhile, the international reaction has been mixed. On one hand, there are signs of relief. Markets have responded positively in the short term. On the other, analysts warn that agreements like this, when they are temporary and limited, can create the appearance of stability, but not necessarily a lasting one. And that brings us to another important point. The context. This agreement did not arrive during a moment of calm. It came right after an escalation, at a point where the risk of a larger conflict was real, and that opens another possibility, that this ceasefire is not the result of a clear victory, but rather a need to stop the situation before it intensifies. Because in scenarios like this, stopping does not always mean winning. Sometimes it means avoiding something worse. And that is where the narrative begins to split, because while Washington speaks of victory, other voices are raising questions about the true scope of the agreement, about its long-term implications, and about what could happen once this 2-week period ends. For now, the only confirmed fact is this: the conflict has been paused, but it has not been resolved. And that is what makes this moment critical, because what happens next will determine whether this agreement was truly an endpoint, or simply a pause before the next phase. As the hours pass, the agreement begins to look different, no longer just as a pause, but as something to analyze, because when you look at it more closely, a pattern begins to emerge, a pattern that does not fully match the idea of a total victory. First, the balance. In a conflict, when one side clearly wins, it usually shows in visible changes, in territorial control, in imposed conditions, in decisions that create a clear difference. But in this case, those changes are not so obvious. The Strait of Hormuz remains under the same influence. The flow of energy still depends on that area, and that means one of the most strategic points of the conflict has not changed. And that matters, because that was one of the main sources of tension. But there is another element that is starting to stand out: the narrative, because while the agreement is being presented as an achievement from the United States, the message from Iran is different. There is no talk of defeat, no talk of concessions. Instead, there is talk of resistance, of holding positions, even of achieving certain objectives. And when both sides project an image of victory, the situation becomes less clear, because in most conflicts, that does not happen. There is usually a more defined outcome. Here, there isn't. Here, there are two versions, and between those two versions, there is a space of uncertainty. Meanwhile, time continues to move forward. 2 weeks. That is the window, a short period for a conflict of this scale. And that introduces another factor: stability. Because a time-limited agreement does not guarantee continuity. It does not ensure that conditions will hold. It does not prevent tensions from returning. And that is what many analysts are observing, that this ceasefire could be just a tactical pause, a moment to reorganize forces, to assess damage, to redefine strategies, and if that is the case, then the conflict did not end. It simply changed pace. But there is more. The moment in which this agreement happened, it was not announced during a calm period. It came after a phase of high tension, after attacks, after warnings, at a point where the risk of escalation was high, and that changes the interpretation. Because when an agreement happens just before a possible escalation, it can be seen differently, as a decision to contain, to prevent the situation from becoming more serious, and that does not necessarily mean victory. It means a strategic pause, Meanwhile, the global impact is already being felt. Markets are reacting. Oil prices are shifting. Political decisions in other countries are beginning to adjust. Because this conflict is not isolated, it affects supply chains. It affects energy decisions. It affects international relations. And that is why every detail matters. Every word, every condition, every silence. Because in the spaces where information is unclear, that is where the biggest doubts emerge. And those doubts are now growing. About what the agreement actually includes. About what was agreed and what was not. About what could happen when these 2 weeks come to an end. Because that is the next critical point. The end of the deadline. What happens next? Will the agreement be extended? Will it become something more permanent? Or will tensions return? For now, there is no clear answer. And that lack of clarity is what is holding the world's attention, because if one thing has become evident, it is that this is not a final resolution. It is a moment of transition, a point where everything can move in different directions. And in that context, the initial narrative begins to shift from a total victory to something much more complex, more open, more uncertain. Because in the end, the question remains the same. Who really won? And so far, there is no clear answer. The only thing that can be said with certainty is this. The conflict has paused, but it has not disappeared. And in situations like this, what does not disappear? Sooner or later returns, maybe in a different form, maybe with greater intensity, but it returns. And that is why this moment is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new phase, a phase where the decisions that are made could define not only this conflict, but the global balance in the years ahead. And that is what is truly at stake. Not just who won today, but what will happen next. Because in situations like this, the real outcome is not seen at the moment of the announcement. It is seen over time, and that time is just beginning. Now the focus shifts, because this is no longer about what was announced. It's about what happens next. And right now, everything points to one thing. Time. 2 weeks. That is the window. That is the limit. And that changes everything, because this is not a stable agreement. That's a countdown. Every day that passes brings both sides closer to a decision. And that decision could define what happens next. Because in situations like this, time is not neutral. Time adds pressure. Time increases risk. Time forces movement. And that's exactly what is happening now. Behind the scenes, things are still moving. Negotiations may be happening. Strategies are being adjusted. Positions are being evaluated, but none of that is fully visible. And that's what makes this moment so uncertain. Because what we see publicly, it is only part of the picture. The rest is happening out of view. And that's where the real tension is. Because this agreement is not just about stopping conflict, it's about what each side is preparing to do next. And that leads to the next question. What happens if this agreement fails? Because that possibility is real. Very real. If the ceasefire breaks, the situation doesn't go back to zero. It escalates. Faster. Stronger. With less room for negotiation, because both sides would return to the conflict with more tension built up. More pressure. And fewer options. And that's where things become dangerous, because escalation after a pause is usually more intense than before. And there is another factor that cannot be ignored. Energy. The global system is watching closely, because even the possibility of instability in key routes, like the Strait of Hormuz, is enough to affect the entire world. Prices react, markets shift, decisions change. And that means this situation is no longer regional, it's global, because energy connects everything, from governments to everyday life. And that's why every signal matters, even small ones. A statement, a movement, a delay, anything can trigger a reaction. And right now, everyone is watching those signals closely, because there is another layer to this situation. Other countries, even if they are not directly involved, they are affected, they are preparing, they are adjusting. And in some cases, they are positioning themselves, because in conflicts like this, the impact spreads. And when it spreads, control becomes harder. That's why this moment is so critical, because it is not just about two countries. It is about a system global system that reacts to instability. And right now, that system is on alert. But there is something even more important, something that is not being said directly, the pressure. Because even though the conflict has paused, the pressure has not disappeared, it has only changed form. Now, it is quieter, less visible, but still there, and in some ways, even stronger. Because now, both sides are under pressure to decide to move forward, to either stabilize the situation or prepare for what comes next. And that is where the uncertainty grows. Because there is no clear path yet, there is no confirmed outcome, there is only a window, a limited one, and within that window, everything can change. That's why this is not just a pause, that's a transition. A moment between two possible outcomes. One leads to stability. The other leads back to conflict. And right now, no one can say which one will happen, because the next move has not been made yet, and until it is, the tension remains. the uncertainty remains, the risk remains, and that is why this moment matters more than the announcement itself, because announcements can create expectations, but outcomes are defined by what happens next, and right now, what happens next is still undecided, which means one thing is clear. The situation is not resolved. It is waiting, and when something like this is waiting, it usually doesn't stay quiet for long. At this point, one thing is clear, this is not the end of the story. It only looks like one, because when you step back, when you look beyond the announcement, beyond the headlines, beyond the idea of a total victory, what you actually see is something very different. You see a pause, a fragile one. You see a balance that hasn't been broken. You see a conflict that hasn't been resolved. And that changes everything. Because in reality, the outcome has not happened yet. It is still forming, still developing, still uncertain, and that is what makes this moment so important. Because what was presented as a conclusion may actually be the beginning of something else, something bigger, something more complex. Because if you look at the key elements, they are still there. The tension is still there. The strategic interests are still there. The pressure is still there. Nothing has disappeared. It has only been contained. For now, and history has shown something very clear. When conflicts are contained but not resolved, they don't stay quiet. They return. Sometimes differently, sometimes more intensely, but they return. And that is the risk now. Not what has already happened, but what could happen next. Because the real question is no longer, did one side win? The real question is, what was delayed? And for how long? Because if this agreement was meant to stop escalation, then we have to ask, did it solve the problem? Or just postpone it? And that difference matters a lot, because postponing a conflict does not eliminate it. It gives it time. Time to adapt. Time to evolve. Time to return in a different form. And that is what many are now watching closely. Because this situation is not stable. It is sensitive. It depends on decisions that have not yet been made, on negotiations that may still be happening, on strategies that are still being shaped. And that means the outcome is still open, still undefined. Still at risk. And that is why the narrative matters, because the way this moment is described shapes how it is understood. One version says victory. Another version suggests temporary pause. And between those two, there is a gap filled with uncertainty. Because if this were truly a clear victory, there would be no doubt, no questions, no ambiguity. But that is not what we are seeing. What we are seeing is a situation that raises more questions than answers, and that is always a signal that the full story has not been told yet. But there is one thing that can be said with certainty. This moment matters, not because of what has ended, but because of what could begin, because in the coming days, in the coming weeks, decisions will be made, and those decisions will determine everything. Whether this pause becomes stability, or becomes the starting point of a new phase, a phase that could be more intense, more complex, and harder to control. Because once a conflict reaches this point, there is no simple outcome, there are only possibilities. And right now, all of them are still on the table, which means one thing: the story is not over, it is still unfolding, and the real result has not happened yet.